At 6:32 p.m. on August 31st, 2024, a 14-year-old boy made a call that would become the first recorded moment of a tragedy inside a Coral Springs, Florida home. His father had been shot, but according to the boy, his father was still breathing. And there was something else the person on the other end of that emergency call did not yet know. The person who had allegedly fired the gun was still inside the house.
My dad's been shot.
What happened?
My dad's been shot.
Your dog is in shock?
My dad has been shot.
Is he awake? Is he breathing?
Yeah, he's breathing.
Okay, who shot him? Did you see who shot him?
I didn't see.
Okay, where did he get shot?
His shoulder.
Where is the gun near him? Did he shoot himself?
Someone just randomly shot him.
Someone just randomly shot him?
It was a mistake.
Notice what the boy never gives the dispatcher: a name. And there's a third voice in that house somewhere behind him.
He said to come now. A dry cloth?
What's that?
He said to get a dry cloth.
How long ago did this happen?
Like 5 minutes ago.
Can you ask your dad who it was that shot him? Does he know the person?
I don't think he knows. He wants you to come now.
Where's your dad right now?
He's on the ground.
Go ahead and open up the front door. We have officers there.
5 minutes. That's how long it takes the first units to reach the driveway. And within seconds of getting there, they're asking about only one person.
Somebody peeking out the window.
Where's your dad? Mom, where's mom at?
Where's mom? Come on.
Coral Springs police, come outside!
Boys, come here. Come here. Let me just pat you down really quick. No weapons on you? Alright, come over here. Behind the. Come on, over here. Guys, back up behind that car, please. Go.
Coral Springs police, come outside! Coral Springs police, come outside! Where's your mom at?
Where's mom at?
I got shot fired inside the house. Coral Springs police, give me a shield. Anybody got a shield? There's a female inside. The mom's still inside. Come out with your hands up. You get your shot. Come on out. Come out. Come out. Come out to me now. Keep coming out. Do it now. Keep coming out. Turn away from me. Hey, hands. Back. Who's inside? Who's got a gun?
The caller was just 14 years old. He was frightened. He didn't have all the answers. He couldn't immediately identify the person who had shot his father, but he knew his father was hurt, and he knew he needed help. So he called 911. Approximately 5 minutes later, police officers arrived. 2 teenage boys came out of the house. A woman remained inside. And then officers heard another gunshot.
Where's mom at?
Coral Springs police, come outside! I got shot fired.
That detail would become critical. Because this wasn't a gunshot that happened before police knew there was an emergency. It happened after officers had already reached the property. So tonight, we're going back through those minutes carefully. What did that 14-year-old actually tell the 911 dispatcher? What questions was he asked? What information did emergency services have before officers arrived? How quickly did police respond? And once officers reached the house, what happened next? Most importantly, could anything about that initial emergency call have changed the outcome for Rohan Malcolm? We have to be extremely careful with that question. There is no documented evidence proving that the dispatcher caused Rohan Malcolm's death. There is also no evidence establishing that a different question, instruction, or dispatch decision would definitely have prevented the killing. But there is a documented sequence of events. There is the emergency call. There is the police response. There are the statements from the teenagers. There is Denise Malcolm's interview with detectives. There is the physical evidence. And there is the final court outcome. And early in this investigation, you're going to hear something especially important. We're going to introduce the full 911 dispatcher audio from the beginning, rather than relying only on selected moments. You'll hear the teenager's call as it was recorded, including the information he gave the dispatcher and the questions he was asked. So before we interpret what happened, you'll be able to hear the call for yourself. Because once you know how this story ends, it's easy to look backward and assume that everyone involved knew what we know now. They didn't. The dispatcher didn't. The officers responding to the house didn't. And the 14-year-old making that call certainly didn't. This is the story of Rohan Malcolm, his wife Denise, their 2 teenage sons, and the emergency call that brought Coral Springs police to their home. And this is the question at the center of it all. Did 911 fail him? Before we get into the evidence, if you value fact-based true crime investigations that separate what is documented from what is only speculation, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Brian Case Records. It helps us continue covering cases like this with the details, timelines, and evidence placed in their proper context. Now, let's go back to August 31st, 2024. It was the Saturday of Labor Day weekend. Inside the Malcolm home in Coral Springs, Florida, preparations were underway for a family barbecue. Rohan Malcolm was 52 years old. His wife, Denise Malcolm, was 45. And living with them were their 14-year-old twin sons. From the outside, the family was preparing for a holiday weekend. But according to what Denise later told detectives, there were serious problems inside the marriage. She described a relationship that had deteriorated over time. She told investigators she believed Rohan had been unfaithful. She described repeated arguments involving trust and infidelity, and she said the couple had been sleeping in separate rooms. Those claims are important to the investigation, but they need to be described accurately. They came from Denise's account after the shooting. They should not automatically be treated as independent proof of every allegation she made about her husband. What they do provide is a picture of what Denise told investigators was happening inside the marriage before the shooting. Earlier that day, according to her account, the family was preparing for the following day's cookout. Denise and Rohan had reportedly gone shopping. They bought food and other supplies. There were plans for the family to spend the holiday together. But after they returned home, Denise said the situation changed. According to her statement to detectives, Rohan told her he was planning to leave with a friend. Denise questioned the explanation. She believed there was more to the story. According to her account, she suspected another woman was involved. The disagreement escalated into an argument. And eventually, Denise made a decision that would permanently change the lives of everyone inside that home. She went to retrieve a firearm. According to the statement she later gave investigators, the handgun had been stored inside a case in a closet. She retrieved it. She prepared it. And then she returned to the area where Rohan was. What happened next would eventually be pieced together from several different sources. The statements of the teenagers, the physical evidence, the police observations, and Denise's own account. But before detectives ever sat down with Denise, before the crime scene was processed, and before the public knew the details of the case, one teenager reached for a phone. And that phone call became the beginning of the official response. The 14-year-old called 911. The dispatcher answered. The boy reported that his father had been shot. The dispatcher began asking questions. Was his father awake? Was he breathing? The boy indicated that his father was still breathing. Then came another critical question. Who had shot him? The teenager did not provide a name. He said he did not know. He also could not immediately provide the dispatcher with a clear identification of the person responsible. But he was able to communicate the most important fact he knew. His father had been shot. The dispatcher continued gathering information. The boy indicated where his father had been wounded, He said his father was on the ground, and he told the dispatcher that the shooting had happened only minutes earlier. Now, before we move forward, this is where I want you to hear the call itself. Not a recreation, not a shortened summary. The full 911 dispatcher audio from the beginning. Listen to the questions. Listen to the teenager's answers, and pay attention to what information was available to the dispatcher before officers reached the house. What you just heard is the starting point for understanding everything that happened afterward. The caller was a 14-year-old inside the house. His father had been shot. The teenager did not identify his mother as the shooter during that initial call. He said he didn't know who had done it. And from the information communicated over the phone, emergency services began sending officers toward the address. According to the documented timeline, the first officers arrived approximately 5 minutes after the call. 5 minutes. But when they reached the house, they were not arriving at a situation that had already ended. They were entering an active and potentially dangerous scene. A shooting had been reported. A man was believed to be injured. 2 teenagers were still inside, and an armed person could potentially still be somewhere in the residence. Officers began issuing commands. They ordered the occupants to come outside. The 2 teenage boys eventually emerged. Police moved them away from the residence, but there was still one person inside. Their mother, Denise Malcolm, remained in the house. Officers continued ordering her to come outside. And then came another sound. A gunshot. Police heard a loud bang from inside the residence. The significance of that moment would become clear later. According to the investigation, this was the final shot fired at Rohan Malcolm. And it happened after officers had already arrived at the home. That fact is central to the question we're examining. The initial 911 call had reported an injured man who was still breathing. Police were dispatched. Officers arrived. The children were brought outside. Denise remained inside. Then another shot was fired. Officers continued ordering Denise to come out. Eventually, she did. Police detained her. The residence was secured, and officers went inside. That's when they found Rohan Malcolm. He had suffered multiple gunshot wounds. He was dead. The call that had begun as a request for emergency medical and police assistance had now become a homicide investigation. And investigators had to reconstruct what had happened inside the house. Who fired the gun? How many shots were fired? Where was Rohan when the shooting began? Where was Denise? What happened after the first shots? And why was another shot fired while police were already outside? The answers would not come from one piece of evidence. Investigators had to put the entire timeline together. The teenage brothers became important witnesses. They were 14 years old. They had just experienced the shooting of their father, and investigators needed to establish what each boy had heard and seen. The brothers were separated and questioned independently. Their accounts were not identical. That is important because eyewitness accounts can differ, especially during traumatic events. Investigators therefore had to compare what each teenager said with the physical evidence and the rest of the investigation. One of the boys described being in his bedroom when he heard loud noises. At first, he did not understand what was happening. Then he realized something was wrong. He moved toward the area where his father was. And according to the account investigators documented, he saw his mother holding a handgun. He also saw his father after he had been shot. The other brother provided his own account of where he had been and what he heard. Investigators continued asking questions. Where were you? What did you hear? What did you see? What happened after the shots? The purpose was not simply to collect a dramatic story. It was to establish a timeline. Because in this case, timing mattered enormously. The first shots, the emergency call, the arrival of police, the boys coming outside, Denise remaining inside, and the final gunshot. Those moments had to be placed in order. Meanwhile, Denise was taken to the Coral Springs Police Department. There, detectives began interviewing her. She was advised of her rights. She agreed to speak with investigators. And over the course of that interview, Denise gave detectives her account of what had happened. She began by discussing her relationship with Rohan. She described what she believed had been years of betrayal. She talked about alleged infidelity. She said the marriage had deteriorated, and she told detectives that she had considered leaving. The detectives then began narrowing the conversation toward the events of that evening. What happened after they returned from shopping? Why did the argument begin? What did Rohan say? What did Denise do? And how did the firearm become involved? According to Denise, the disagreement centered partly around Rohan's plans to leave with a friend. She believed he was not being truthful about where he was going. She connected that belief to her suspicions about another woman. The argument continued, and then she retrieved the gun. That part of the statement would become especially significant, because Denise told investigators that the gun was stored away. She went to get it. She prepared it, and she brought it back. That sequence became part of the evidence investigators considered when examining what happened. Denise acknowledged firing multiple shots. She said she could not remember exactly how many, but detectives focused heavily on what happened after police arrived, because there was one more shot, the one officers heard from outside. According to Denise's account, she had contemplated killing herself. She said that was what she had intended to do. But Rohan was still alive. She told investigators that something he said affected her, and she fired again. The exact words Rohan allegedly said were not established in the publicly documented record, so we should stop there. There is no reason to invent a conversation that the evidence does not give us. What we can say is that Denise acknowledged firing the final shot. Investigators believed that shot struck Rohan in the head, and the timing of that shot matched a critical observation made by officers outside the home. They had heard it. They had already arrived, and it came before Denise finally exited. That connection between the police observations and Denise's later account became one of the important elements of the investigation. Now return to the question on the screen. Did 911 fail him? It's a powerful question. But a responsible investigation cannot turn a question into a conclusion. We have to distinguish between what we know and what we can only imagine. We know the teenager called. We know he reported that his father had been shot. We know he said his father was breathing. We know he did not initially identify the shooter. We know police were dispatched. We know officers arrived approximately 5 minutes later. We know the two teenagers came outside. We know Denise remained inside. We know officers heard another gunshot. And we know Rohan was ultimately found dead inside the home. What we do not know is whether a different question from the dispatcher would have changed what Denise did. We don't know whether an alternative instruction would have caused officers to arrive sooner, and we cannot responsibly claim that any particular change would have guaranteed Rohan's survival. Those are hypothetical questions. But the timeline itself is not hypothetical, and that's why the full audio matters. It allows us to hear the emergency from the perspective of the teenager before the ending was known. The caller was not calmly giving investigators a complete account. He was a 14-year-old trying to get help. The dispatcher had to work with the information he was able to provide, and officers were then sent to the address. Approximately 5 minutes later, they were there. But the emergency continued. The boys came outside. Denise did not. Then another shot rang out. This is why the 911 call should not be treated as an isolated event. It was the first link in a chain. The call triggered the response. The response brought police to the home. The arrival of police changed the circumstances inside the house. And despite their presence outside, another shot was fired. Eventually, Denise came out. The house was secured, and investigators entered. Inside, they found the victim. From that moment forward, the investigation shifted from emergency response to evidence collection. The firearm was recovered. The scene was documented. Evidence was collected. Denise's clothing was taken. DNA samples were obtained. Investigators examined her hands and fingernails, and detectives continued reconstructing the shooting. Every piece mattered, because the case would eventually move into the court system, and investigators needed to establish not only who fired the gun, but what happened before, during, and after the shooting. The evidence increasingly centered on Denise. Her sons had described seeing her with the weapon. She acknowledged retrieving the firearm. She acknowledged firing it. And she acknowledged the final shot. But identifying the shooter was only one part of the case. Investigators also had to examine intent. What happened during the argument? Was the shooting planned? What was Denise thinking when she retrieved the weapon? And what happened when police arrived? Those questions were particularly important because Denise was initially arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The case would eventually take a different legal path. But before we reach that outcome, it is worth returning once more to the first minutes of the night. A 14-year-old boy had called for help. His father was injured. Police were dispatched, and officers arrived within approximately 5 minutes. That response time is important when considering the question of whether the emergency response failed. The documented timeline does not show police ignoring the call for an extended period. Instead, it shows officers arriving while the situation was still unfolding. And that created another problem. They had to get the children out. They had to determine who remained inside. They had to deal with the possibility of an armed suspect. And they had to do all of that without immediately knowing everything investigators would eventually learn. The boys were brought outside. Denise remained inside. Officers issued commands. And then the final gunshot occurred. That is a crucial fact. Because whatever questions remain about the initial emergency call, the final fatal sequence occurred after police had reached the property. There is no documented evidence that allows us to say a dispatcher could have guaranteed a different outcome. But there is also nothing wrong with examining the call closely. That is what an investigation does. It looks at the information, it reconstructs the timeline, and it asks what happened at each stage. The 911 call provides the earliest documented window into the emergency. The police response provides the next. The teenager's statements provide another. Denise's interview provides another. And the physical evidence connects those accounts to the scene. Taken together, those pieces helped investigators establish what happened. Rohan Malcolm had been shot. His wife was responsible for the shooting. And Denise ultimately faced a murder charge. The case remained unresolved for months. Then, on June 11, 2025, Denise Malcolm entered a no-contest plea to second-degree murder with a firearm in connection with Rohan's death. She was sentenced to 21 years in Florida State Prison. She also received credit for time already spent in custody. There would be no jury trial deciding the case after a full presentation of the evidence. The plea resolved the criminal case. But it did not change what happened to the family. Rohan was dead. His 2 sons had lost their father. Their mother was sent to prison. And the entire sequence had begun with one teenager trying to summon help. If you're following this case closely, remember that detail. The first person to reach emergency services was not a detective, not an officer, not an adult witness. It was Rohan Malcolm's 14-year-old son. And his call created the first official record of what was happening inside that house. That's why the audio is so important. When you hear the full recording, you're not hearing the case from the perspective of someone who already knows the ending. You're hearing the beginning. You're hearing the uncertainty. You're hearing what the teenager knew, and you're hearing what he didn't know. That difference matters. Because once we know that Denise was ultimately arrested, it's tempting to look back at every word of the call and assume the dispatcher should have immediately known who was responsible. But the dispatcher didn't have the benefit of the investigation that came afterward. She didn't have the teenage brother's later interviews. She didn't have Denise's confession-like admissions during questioning. She didn't have the physical evidence. And she didn't have the final court records. She had an emergency call, a teenager, an injured father, and limited information. That is the situation that should be evaluated, not a version reconstructed with hindsight. The same principle applies to the officers. When they arrived, they didn't have the full story either. They had a reported shooting. They had children inside. They had a possible armed person inside. And they had an injured man somewhere in the house. They moved the children out. They ordered Denise outside. And then another shot was fired. After she exited, they secured the residence and found Rohan. The investigation that followed would fill in the gaps. Denise described the argument. She described retrieving the firearm. She acknowledged firing multiple times. And she acknowledged the final shot. The physical evidence was collected and documented. The teenagers' accounts were recorded, and the case moved forward. Eventually, the first-degree murder charge was resolved through a second-degree murder plea. The sentence was 21 years. That is the final legal outcome. But the central question that began this story remains more difficult. Did 911 fail him? There is no documented answer that allows us to say yes. There is also no reason to pretend the question doesn't deserve examination. Because emergency calls can be measured, response times can be examined, information can be reviewed, and the sequence of events can be reconstructed. In this case, the record shows a teenager making the call at approximately 6:32 p.m., police arriving approximately 5 minutes later, 2 teenagers coming outside, Denise remaining inside, another gunshot being heard, Denise exiting, and Rohan being found dead. That is what we know. The rest requires caution. Could the outcome have been different? Possibly. Could it have been different because of something said during the call? We cannot establish that from the documented evidence. Could it have been different because the shooter was still inside after police arrived? Again, that is a hypothetical. The only responsible approach is to acknowledge the uncertainty. But that does not make the case any less disturbing, because the teenager's call tells us that Rohan was still alive when emergency services were first contacted, and the final shot came later. That creates a timeline measured in minutes. Minutes between the call and the arrival of officers. Minutes between the officers reaching the property and the final gunshot. And those minutes are the reason this case continues to raise questions. The emergency call was not the end of the story. It was the beginning. The investigation that followed would reveal a deteriorating marriage, allegations of infidelity, an argument, a firearm retrieved from a closet, multiple shots, and finally, the gunshot heard by officers outside. The police investigation would lead to an arrest. The criminal case would eventually result in a second-degree murder plea, and Denise Malcolm would receive a 21-year prison sentence. But none of that was known at 6:32 p.m. At that moment, there was only a teenage boy asking for help. His father had been shot. He was still breathing. The person responsible was apparently still somewhere inside the house. The dispatcher asked questions. The teenager answered as best he could. Officers were sent. And approximately 5 minutes later, they arrived. That is where the story changes, because now the emergency responders were physically there, and yet the situation was not over. The boys were brought outside. Denise remained inside. Police called for her to come out, and another shot was heard. That moment is impossible to ignore. It is also impossible to analyze responsibly without acknowledging everything that happened before it. The emergency call, the information available, the police response, the location of the victim, the position of Denise, and the circumstances inside the home. Every one of those details matters, and together, they explain why the question surrounding the 911 call is so difficult. There is no simple villain in the dispatch timeline. There is no documented evidence that allows us to say one person could have pressed the right button or asked the right question and guaranteed a different ending. What there is, however, is a recording made while the emergency was happening. And that recording gives us something rare. It lets us hear the first moments before the investigation shaped the story. before detectives knew what Denise would eventually say, before investigators finished processing the house, before prosecutors presented the case, before the court imposed a sentence. The call preserves what was known at the beginning, and that is why we began this investigation there. At approximately 6:32 p.m., August 31st, 2024. Coral Springs, Florida. A 14-year-old boy picks up the phone. His father has been shot. His father is still breathing, and the person who allegedly fired the gun is still inside. 5 minutes later, police arrive. 2 boys come outside. 1 woman remains inside. Then another gunshot, and inside the house is Rohan Malcolm, dead. The investigation that follows will eventually establish Denise Malcolm's role in the shooting. But the first official alarm came from her son, a teenager who did not know exactly what was happening, a teenager who did not have every answer, a teenager who simply knew that his father needed help. That is the beginning of this case. And that is why the full 911 recording matters. Not because it gives us a simple answer, but because it allows us to hear the emergency before hindsight changes the way we interpret it. So when you hear that recording, listen carefully. Listen to the teenager. Listen to the questions. Listen to the information being communicated. And remember that everyone on that call was working with only part of the picture. The dispatcher didn't know how the night would end. The officers driving toward the house didn't know. The teenager didn't know. And Rohan Malcolm didn't know. But within minutes, the decisions and events unfolding inside that home would become permanent. 1 man would die. 1 woman would eventually receive a 21-year prison sentence. 2 teenagers would lose their father. And 1 emergency call would become a key part of the timeline investigators used to reconstruct the night. The question remains, did 911 fail him? We may never have a definitive answer to the hypothetical, but we can examine the facts. We can hear the call. We can follow the response. And we can understand exactly what happened between the first request for help and the final gunshot. That's what we're doing here at Bryan Case Records. If you found this investigation valuable, make sure you like the video, subscribe to Bryan Case Records, and turn on notifications. And if you have an opinion about the 911 response after hearing the full recording, leave your thoughts in the comments, but keep the discussion focused on the documented evidence. Because in cases like this, the difference between a question and an accusation matters. And the difference between suspicion and proof matters even more. Rohan Malcolm's story deserves both. The evidence deserves careful examination, and the timeline deserves to be heard exactly as it happened. This was not simply a story that began when police arrived. It began several minutes earlier, with a 14-year-old boy, a phone, a desperate call for help, and a father who was still alive. And that is where the investigation truly begins.